Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Tonight, we're exploring an idea that has quietly shaped a century of horror. The monsters that were never meant to frighten through claws or violence, but through the implications their existence carries. These are the most philosophically terrifying entities in cosmic horror, creatures designed not as antagonists in a traditional story, but as disruptions of meaning, scale, and certainty. They challenge the assumptions that make consciousness feel stable, and they do so with a calm inevitability that is far more unsettling than any dramatic threat. Consider this carefully. When writers like Lovecraft, Machen, and later mythmakers imagined these beings, they were not constructing villains. They were creating intellectual problems, entities whose nature exposes limits in human perception, history, and even ontology. The deeper you look, the more each creature becomes less character and more a hypothesis about what might exist beyond human comprehension. In this documentary, we will move slowly and deliberately through their origins, their symbolic functions, and their cultural afterlives. Our approach is investigative. We treat each monster as a clue, each narrative as a document, and each interpretation as part of a larger pattern scholars have attempted to understand for more than 100 years. By staying with these ideas, you participate in that long inquiry, becoming one more voice in a conversation that never fully resolves. And perhaps that is the unsettling part. Simply by listening, you are already involved. The emergence of philosophically terrifying cosmic monsters occurred within a very specific historical climate, one shaped by intellectual upheaval and growing awareness of humanity's diminishing place in the universe. By the late 19th century, Western culture was experiencing a slow but decisive erosion of metaphysical certainty. Darwinian evolution had already unsettled traditional hierarchies by suggesting that human beings were not the inevitable crown of creation, but one branch in a vast biological continuum. Meanwhile, developments in geology, astronomy, and physics expanded temporal and spatial scales beyond anything earlier generations had imagined. It is within this environment that writers such as H.P. Lovecraft and Arthur Machen began crafting entities whose purpose was not to thrill, but to unsettle, using literary form to confront the implications of a universe largely indifferent to human meaning. This period also saw the rise of what scholars often call epistemic destabilization, a cultural moment when scientific advancement produced answers that carried troubling questions of their own. Consider the revelations of 1905 and 1915, when Einstein's theories undermined the intuitive stability of time and space. Ideas once taught as fundamental, absolute time, fixed frames of reference began slipping from intellectual grasp. Writers recognized the philosophical potential of this shift. Instead of inventing monsters that violated biological norms, they imagined entities that operated according to principles unknown to physics itself. A creature that defied Euclidean geometry or existed across multiple dimensional frameworks was not simply a story invention. It was a literary response to scientific paradigms that were themselves disrupting long-held assumptions about order and reality. We must pause here to note another influence often overlooked: the collapse of older narrative certainties in literature. By the early 20th century, modernism had begun destabilizing traditional forms of storytelling, embracing fragmentation, interiority, and uncertainty. Readers accustomed to linear narratives and reliable narrators found themselves navigating works shaped by ambiguity and dislocation. Cosmic horror writers took this shift seriously, using narrative fragmentation not as a stylistic flourish, but as an assertion that the monstrous could not be comprehended through stable perspective. When a narrator in 1926 insists that language fails before the creature he describes, he echoes a broader artistic tradition skeptical of representation itself. The creators of these monsters were not merely working within cultural change. Many consciously articulated their goals. Lovecraft wrote repeatedly that his aim was to evoke cosmic fear, which he defined as the realization that human beings occupy a negligible position within a vast, impersonal cosmos. Machen spoke of the terror of the unseen, a fear rooted in the suggestion that reality contains layers inaccessible to ordinary perception. Their monsters were therefore constructed as philosophical provocations. They were designed to foreground ideas rather than actions, and to raise questions rather than to resolve them. This intent partly explains why so many of these beings remain unnamed or only partially described. Incompleteness functions as a narrative acknowledgement of human cognitive limits. Historical context also reveals why these monsters rarely possess motives that resemble human intention. During the early 20th century, determinism, mechanism, and the emerging discipline of psychoanalysis were challenging the notion of coherent human agency. Many writers absorbed these ideas, crafting monsters that acted according to principles outside moral reasoning altogether. A being whose existence does not hinge on good or evil, but on forces akin to gravity or entropy, embodies the philosophical concerns of its era. It evokes a world in which causation is mechanical, morality is constructed, and agency is limited. A theme that resonated strongly in the decades following World War I, when technological slaughter forced societies to confront the fragility of human meaning. A key moment occurs when we recognize how deliberately these authors blurred the line between fiction and scholarship. They embedded citations to non-existent books, referenced fabricated archaeological findings, and employed the tone of academic detachment to build plausibility. This strategy, first visible in works of the 1890s and refined throughout the 1920s, gave cosmic monsters an unusual sense of historical depth. They were not presented as newly invented horrors, but as rediscovered fragments of a forgotten cosmology. The technique created what might be called pseudo-antiquity, a literary structure in which modernity appears as the brief surface of a deeper, darker history. Such framing magnifies philosophical terror by implying that human civilization rests atop knowledge intentionally concealed or disastrously ignored. These contextual and creative foundations reveal why cosmic monsters differ so sharply from traditional literary antagonists. They are not obstacles to be overcome. They are disruptions in conceptual order, embodiments of the idea that the universe operates on principles fundamentally incompatible with human understanding. This shift, from monsters as narrative threats to monsters as ontological problems, became the defining hallmark of the genre. It also explains why these beings continue to feel relevant today, as contemporary science further challenges assumptions about reality, agency, and perception. This historical analysis leads naturally into the next subsection, which explores the deeper cultural and philosophical antecedents that shaped these entities long before they appeared on the page. The philosophically terrifying monsters of cosmic horror did not emerge from a cultural vacuum. They represent the convergence of older mythic structures, religious anxieties, philosophical critiques, and shifting intellectual worldviews. When we examine their deeper antecedents, we discover a lineage that stretches back through antiquity, touching civilizations that constructed their cosmologies around forces indifferent to human striving. This continuity matters because it reveals that the modern cosmic monster is less an invention than a reinterpretation, a contemporary expression of fears humanity has articulated for thousands of years, often in symbolic or mythopoetic terms rather than explicit philosophical analysis. Ancient Near Eastern mythology provides one of the earliest frameworks. Texts from Mesopotamia, particularly Sumerian and Babylonian traditions, describe primordial beings that embody chaos rather than malevolence. Tiamat, for instance, appears not as a villain, but as an ancient, pre-ordered force whose conflict with younger gods mirrors the struggle between cosmic entropy and emerging structure. These myths articulate a worldview in which creation is fragile and temporary, constantly threatened by forces that lie beyond comprehension or negotiation. When modern writers imagine entities older than the universe or indifferent to human existence, they participate, whether consciously or not, in this ancient tradition. The continuity is not literal, but conceptual. Both traditions recognize that the cosmos may not have been built with human purpose in mind. Greek philosophy echoes this theme in a different register. Thinkers like Democritus and Lucretius proposed atomistic universes governed by impersonal laws rather than divine intention. Their cosmologies implied a world without moral architecture, one in which human life held no special metaphysical significance. Later philosophical systems, particularly Neoplatonism, introduced complex hierarchies of being, including intelligences and forces beyond human reasoning. Although not monstrous in a literal sense, these entities destabilize the assumption that human cognition could easily map the structure of reality. When cosmic horror authors introduced beings whose motives or perceptions lie outside all human categories, they revived this ancient philosophical question. What if the universe contains orders of existence beyond our conceptual reach? Gnostic thought adds another important layer. Its central claim that the visible world may be the work of flawed or indifferent cosmic beings casts creation itself as a deceptive or hostile environment. Here we encounter a theme that resonates strongly with cosmic horror, the possibility that reality is structured in ways fundamentally misaligned with human flourishing. The Gnostic archons function as metaphysical obstacles rather than ethical adversaries. Their existence suggests that enlightenment is dangerous, that knowledge destabilizes comfort, and that truth may be corrosive rather than liberating. Writers of cosmic horror adapted this idea by designing monsters whose primary function is to expose the inadequacy of human understanding. When a character goes mad upon glimpsing a forbidden entity, the narrative echoes the Gnostic belief that decoding the true nature of the cosmos leads not to freedom, but to psychological collapse. Eastern traditions contribute a different, though equally significant, antecedent. In Hindu cosmology, the scale of creation, its cycles of birth, dissolution, and rebirth across unimaginable epochs, renders human life inconsequential on a cosmic timeline. Buddhist philosophy, particularly the doctrine of shunyata, or emptiness, challenges the stability of the self and the reliability of perception. These ideas do not imply horror. They aim toward liberation. Yet when filtered through a modern Western framework grappling with scientific uncertainty, they take on unsettling qualities. The idea that the self is a temporary construction, or that reality is not inherently solid, becomes fertile ground for horror writers. Many cosmic monsters embody exactly these philosophical tensions, entities that dissolve boundaries between self and world, or beings whose presence destabilizes the notion that reality is a coherent, continuous structure. It would be incomplete to overlook the influence of early modern skepticism and Enlightenment rationality. As scientific inquiry advanced in the 17th and 18th centuries, thinkers like Descartes, Spinoza, and Hume questioned the reliability of perception and the foundations of knowledge. Although their works were not intended to promote dread, their skepticism created an intellectual climate in which certainty appeared increasingly fragile. Hume's critique of causality, for example, suggests that the order we perceive in the world may be a product of cognitive habit rather than metaphysical truth. Cosmic horror writers seized upon this uncertainty. A monster that violates the laws of physics becomes philosophically plausible within a framework that already questions the extent to which those laws are truly known. By the 19th century, Romanticism introduced yet another strand, the sublime. Writers like Percy Shelley and Caspar David Friedrich emphasized awe mixed with fear, proposing that vastness, darkness, and natural force evoke emotions that transcend comprehension. The sublime is not terror, but it gestures toward the limits of human thought. Cosmic horror inherits this tradition and radicalizes it. Instead of mountains or storms, it presents beings whose existence eclipses meaning itself. The sublime becomes not merely aesthetic, but metaphysical, forcing characters to confront their cognitive boundaries. These cultural and philosophical threads converge in the early 20th century, forming the backdrop against which cosmic monsters take shape. What unites these antecedents is a shared recognition that reality may exceed human comprehension, and that this excess can inspire awe, confusion, or dread depending on the interpretive lens. Cosmic horror emphasizes dread, yet it does so by drawing on intellectual traditions far older and more diverse than the genre itself. Each tradition contributes a different dimension. Ancient myths express the power of primordial chaos. Greek atomism questions cosmic purpose. Gnosticism critiques the structure of reality. Eastern philosophies destabilize the self. Enlightenment skepticism challenges knowledge. Romanticism exposes the emotional limits of perception. This convergence sets the stage for the next subsection, where language and symbolism become the tools through which modern writers encode these philosophical legacies into the very names and descriptions of their monsters. The language surrounding cosmic horror monsters is never incidental. From the late 19th century onward, writers recognized that ordinary vocabulary lacked the capacity to convey beings whose nature lay outside human conceptual frameworks. As a result, they turned to linguistic distortion, invented phonetics and symbolic naming as a way to signal ontological rupture. This strategy did not arise from stylistic indulgence. It emerged from the recognition that a creature defined by its incompatibility with human understanding must, at some level, resist the structures of human speech. The resulting names, cryptic, dissonant, and often unpronounceable, operate as literary devices that mark the boundary between familiar reality and its outer, unseen layers. One of the earliest techniques involves the deliberate manipulation of phonetic structure. Authors crafted names that break from Indo-European patterns, using consonant clusters, glottal stops, and asymmetric syllables to create verbal friction. This linguistic discomfort mirrors the thematic discomfort the creatures produce. A name that resists smooth articulation suggests an entity that resists categorization. In several foundational works from the 1910s and 1920s, writers employed this strategy to imply that even speaking the monster's name requires an unnatural exertion, as though the human vocal apparatus were not designed for such sounds. The linguistic form itself becomes a symbolic gesture toward alien physiology or transdimensional existence. Consider this carefully. The symbolic function of language in cosmic horror is not merely to label, but to destabilize. When a narrator insists that a name cannot be transcribed accurately, or that phonetic approximations inevitably fail, the narrative signals a larger epistemological issue. The failure of language reflects the failure of cognition. If a name cannot be expressed, then the entity it refers to cannot be conceptualized. This technique draws from older traditions in occult literature, where certain words were said to carry power or danger. Yet modern writers invert that pattern. The names of cosmic monsters do not grant agency or insight. They reveal human limitation. The act of naming becomes evidence of partial knowledge rather than mastery. Symbolism also plays a crucial role. Many names contain echoes of ancient linguistic families, Sumerian, Semitic, Gaelic, not to imply historical continuity, but to evoke the impression of forgotten epochs. Writers often embedded fragments of recognizable morphemes within otherwise alien constructions. These faint connections produce a subtle effect. They suggest that humanity once brushed against knowledge, now lost, or that ancestral cultures preserved distorted memories of encounters with incomprehensible entities. This technique aligns with the broader myth-building tradition discussed earlier, offering an illusion of antiquity without explicit historical claims. The name becomes an artifact, a linguistic fossil hinting at an earlier cosmological order. Triadic listing also appears frequently in the descriptive language surrounding these monsters. Narrators speak of angles, movements, and vibrations, or shapes, shadows, and impressions, emphasizing multiplicity rather than precision. These lists function as textual placeholders for phenomena that exceed visual or auditory description. By offering 3 incomplete attempts rather than a singular definitive account, writers convey the sense that perception fractures when confronted with the monstrous. The technique reinforces the idea that cosmic entities cannot be captured within a single sensory or linguistic frame. Instead, they manifest as overlapping impressions that resist syntactic coherence. Writers also borrowed from scientific and mathematical vocabulary when constructing symbolic language. Terms such as non-Euclidean, cyclopean, and translunar appear not for their literal meanings, but for their metaphoric associations. Non-Euclidean, introduced into literary discourse in the early 20th century, signals not simply unusual geometry, but the breakdown of intuitive spatial logic. Cyclopean, used frequently by Lovecraft and others, evokes scale rather than content. It suggests vastness that dwarfs human proportion. These terms highlight a central theme. Cosmic monsters transform the familiar into something structurally incompatible with ordinary experience. Meta-commentary becomes useful here because it reveals something profound about the relationship between language and horror. When narrators hesitate, qualify their descriptions, or confess uncertainty, the text foregrounds linguistic insufficiency. This does not represent narrative weakness. Instead, it reflects the philosophical argument embedded in the genre. Human cognition evolved to navigate terrestrial environments, not to comprehend beings that precede space-time or operate beyond dimensional constraints. The linguistic failure becomes an epistemic signal. It demonstrates that the speaker is trespassing into conceptual territory where neither words nor categories can function reliably. Importantly, symbolic language does more than illustrate the ineffable. It creates the illusion that the monstrous possesses its own linguistic or semiotic system. Characters often encounter inscriptions, chants, or sigils whose meanings remain elusive. These elements gesture toward a communicative order predating humanity, one that structures reality at scales or frequencies humans cannot access. The monster's language, if it can be called that, operates as a metaphor for alien cognition. It implies that understanding requires not translation, but a reconfiguration of perception itself. The terror arises from the recognition that such reconfiguration may not be survivable. The cumulative effect of these linguistic strategies is striking. Names that resist articulation, descriptions that emphasize incompleteness, and symbols that hint at lost civilizations all serve one purpose. They convert language into a philosophical problem. The reader confronts not only the monster, but the limits of speech, thought, and representation. This aligns cosmic horror with broader modernist concerns about the instability of language, yet it applies those concerns to questions of ontology rather than psychology alone. This analysis prepares us for the next subsection, where we examine how writers translate these linguistic and symbolic strategies into broader myth-building techniques that give cosmic monsters a deceptive sense of authenticity and historical depth. The myth-building surrounding cosmic horror monsters relies on a deliberate strategy: the creation of narratives that feel older, broader, and more documented than they actually are. Writers recognized early that the power of these entities increased when they appeared embedded within a larger, fragmented cosmology. Rather than introducing a monster as a newly discovered threat, the narrative frames it as part of a long, obscured history, one recorded imperfectly through folklore, archaeology, academic speculation, and suppressed testimony. This creates a sense of authenticity without requiring explicit historical claims, allowing readers to experience the unsettling impression that the fictional world overlaps with forgotten layers of their own cultural memory. A central technique in this myth-building is the use of pseudo-scholarly apparatus. Writers insert citations to non-existent books, attribute lore to obscure historical figures, or reference academic fields that appear legitimate but veer subtly into the impossible. This strategy draws from 19th century antiquarian writing, where footnotes and textual commentary often supplemented narrative prose. In cosmic horror, however, the apparatus functions not to clarify, but to destabilize. A citation to a fabricated grimoire implies that experts have studied the monster long before the narrator encountered it, while the lack of accessible information suggests intentional suppression or catastrophic loss. The result is a fragmented archive, convincing in its structure, ambiguous in its implications. Writers also rely on archaeological framing to lend weight to these monsters. Discoveries of ancient stones, indecipherable murals, or anomalous artifacts become entry points into broader cosmologies. These elements appear throughout early 20th century stories, often presented with the tone of academic field reports. This approach resonates with a historical moment when archaeology was rapidly expanding, particularly in the Mediterranean and Near East. Public fascination with relics and ruins created fertile ground for narratives in which ancient civilizations served as custodians or victims of incomprehensible entities. The monster thus becomes an implicit participant in human prehistory, its presence woven into the material record, even if scholars fail to interpret the evidence correctly. A related method involves narrative fragmentation. Authors frequently present information through layered accounts, eyewitness testimonies, half-translated manuscripts, oral traditions, and scientific analyses that contradict one another. This multiplicity of perspectives creates epistemic instability. No single account is definitive, yet the overlap among them implies underlying truth. Consider the recurring structure in which a narrator recounts a tale heard from another, who in turn learned it from a dying witness or unearthed document. The chain of transmission becomes part of the narrative texture, revealing the difficulty of reconstructing events that involve beings beyond comprehension. Fragmentation, therefore, is not merely stylistic. It reflects the ontological distance between human storytelling and cosmic reality. Myth-building also depends on strategic omission. Writers rarely provide full histories, genealogies, or explanations for their monsters. Instead, they offer suggestive glimpses, ancient wars between godlike entities, lost continents, or civilizations that vanished after glimpsing forbidden truths. These fragments generate the illusion of a vast mythological system without the need to articulate its entirety. The omissions invite speculation, allowing readers to imagine a more complete cosmology than the text provides. This mechanism of suggestion aligns with the broader thematic emphasis on epistemic limitation. The monster's history remains obscure because humans lack the perspective necessary to comprehend it fully. One particularly effective technique is the integration of cultural syncretism. Narratives imply that disparate mythologies, Egyptian, Norse, Polynesian, or indigenous American, contain distorted references to the same cosmic entities. This does not assert a universal ancient religion. Rather, it proposes that humanity repeatedly encountered glimpses of beings beyond understanding and encoded these moments in symbolic form. Such syncretism echoes 19th century anthropological theories of solar myths and diffusionism, though cosmic horror retools these ideas to emphasize error rather than continuity. The result is a world in which cultural traditions appear less as coherent systems and more as partial, fragmented attempts to interpret phenomena incompatible with human categories. Narrative authenticity also emerges from tonal choices. Authors frequently adopt the restrained voice of a historian, scientist, or antiquarian, even when describing implausible events. This contrast between sober tone and extraordinary content enhances believability. It recalls the documentary style employed in Gothic literature of the 18th century, where journals, letters, and depositions lent credibility to tales of the supernatural. Cosmic horror inherits this documentary impulse, but reshapes it to reflect modern anxieties. Not about ghosts or curses, but about the fragility of knowledge and the instability of perception. When a researcher calmly reports non-Euclidean structures or impossible fossils, the tone suggests that such anomalies belong to an established but unsettling field of inquiry. We must pause here to consider the philosophical significance of these myth-building techniques. Their purpose is not to convince readers of literal truth, but to produce a sense of ontological vertigo. By simulating the texture of ancient myth and scholarly investigation, writers blur the boundary between fiction and cultural history. This effect invites readers to question whether humanity has overlooked or forgotten earlier encounters with incomprehensible forces. The narrative implies that the monstrous is not new, but newly revealed, a reemergence of knowledge once buried or denied. This thematic gesture ties cosmic horror to broader discussions about suppressed histories, lost civilizations, and the limits of historical reconstruction. Another layer of authenticity comes from the way writers depict institutional responses. Universities, museums, secret societies, and government agencies appear throughout the mythos, often shown collecting or concealing information. Their presence suggests that the monstrous operates within a social and bureaucratic framework, however imperfectly understood. The implication that institutions struggle to analyze or contain these entities reinforces the monster's philosophical potency. They are not fictional aberrations, but problems that exceed the capacities of modern epistemic structures. The cumulative effect of these strategies is a mythos that feels organically layered, historically grounded, and intellectually coherent despite its deliberate gaps. The monsters attain a sense of depth because they appear embedded within a long continuum of human misunderstanding. Readers perceive not just isolated horrors, but an entire cosmological architecture partially glimpsed through fractured records. This provides the conceptual bridge to Part 2, where we shift from historical and narrative construction to the deeper philosophical themes that govern the nature of these entities and the worlds they inhabit. The philosophically terrifying monsters at the heart of cosmic horror are not frightening because of their physical form, but because of the concepts they embody. Their presence dramatizes three foundational ideas: human insignificance within a Yog-Sothoth, vast and indifferent cosmos, the slow but inevitable drift of all systems toward entropy, and the unsettling possibility that reality may not be a stable, waking condition, but a permeable dream state shaped by forces outside conscious awareness. These ideas circulate throughout early 20th century literature and persist in later works because they challenge the frameworks humans rely on to interpret experience. The monsters serve as embodiments of these concepts, not allegories but manifestations, figures designed to reveal the philosophical architecture underlying the genre. Cosmic insignificance forms the first pillar of this structure. Writers repeatedly emphasize that human beings occupy no privileged place in the universe. In a 1927 letter, Lovecraft insists that humanity is a transient incident in a geometry too vast to chart, a phrase that encapsulates the genre's worldview. Monsters such as the Great Old Ones represent not threats, but reminders. Their existence implies that human history, morality, and identity matter only within a narrow cognitive bubble. The philosophical weight of this idea arises from its collision with human self-perception. For centuries, religious and philosophical systems positioned humanity at the center of creation. Cosmic horror overturns this orientation, presenting a universe in which humans not only lack significance, but lack relevance. The terror does not come from the monster's power, but from what their existence suggests about the structure of reality. Entropy deepens this terror by framing the universe as a system moving inevitably toward disorder. Many cosmic entities operate as metaphors for decay rather than destruction. Their appearance signals not active malice, but the unraveling of form, structure, and coherence. In one fictional example, often cited by scholars, an unnamed narrator describes a soundless drift of matter toward darkness, suggesting a cosmic process that erodes stability on every scale. These monsters embody entropy by existing outside the temporal frameworks familiar to humans. Their immortality, or more precisely, their indifference to time, implies that human epochs occur within a passing moment of cosmic decline. The philosophical implication is clear. Meaning cannot be preserved, systems cannot endure, and order is temporary. When characters confront such beings, they confront the realization that decay is not a failure of the universe, but its fundamental condition. We must pause here to examine how the theme of entropy intersects with human psychology. Scholars often note that characters in cosmic horror experience dread not from physical threat, but from the recognition that their efforts toward understanding or control are futile. The monster represents a process rather than a personality. It does not attack. It envelops, erodes, or alters the frameworks upon which sanity depends. The terror arises from helplessness in the face of cosmic processes that operate without intention or awareness. This challenges the anthropocentric belief that agency and morality shape the universe. Instead, the monster reveals a cosmos indifferent to human reasoning. The third concept, dream reality, complicates the previous two by destabilizing the boundary between consciousness and the external world. Many cosmic horror narratives blur the line between waking perception and dream state experience, suggesting that reality might be porous, layered, or contingent. In the dream quest tradition, for example, characters encounter beings that exist simultaneously within dreams and in inaccessible physical realms. These beings challenge the assumption that consciousness reflects objective reality. Instead, they imply that the mind may perceive only fragments filtered through biological and cultural limitations. When monsters appear to characters in both dreams and waking life, the narrative signals that the distinction itself may be illusory. This theme resonates with early 20th century psychology, particularly the work of Freud and Jung, who argued that dreams reveal structures of the unconscious inaccessible to waking thought. Cosmic horror expands this idea by suggesting that dreams may also reveal external realities that human cognition cannot process directly. A character who sees the same impossible creature in both dreams and archaeological ruins confronts not coincidence, but ontological collapse. The monster demonstrates that perception is unreliable and that the boundary between mind and world is unstable. The terror does not lie in hallucination, but in the possibility that hallucination and perception operate on a continuum shaped by forces beyond the self. Rhetorical questions often emerge in criticism of this theme because it invites reflection rather than certainty. What becomes of human identity if consciousness is only one layer of a larger, shifting continuum? How does one navigate a world where dreams may contain information inaccessible to rational inquiry? These questions remain open precisely because cosmic horror resists definitive answers. The monsters embody the uncertainty rather than resolve it. Across these three philosophical concepts, a triadic structure becomes apparent. Insignificance challenges humanity's place in the cosmos. Entropy challenges its belief in stability, and dream reality challenges its confidence in perception. Together, they form the intellectual foundation upon which cosmic horror builds its most disturbing creatures. These entities are terrifying not because they violate natural laws, but because they illustrate them at scales humans cannot comprehend. This examination prepares us for the next subsection, where we trace how specific categories of cosmic beings, old ones, outer gods, and dream entities, translate these philosophical concepts into distinct narrative and metaphysical forms. Cosmic horror does not rely on a single taxonomy of monsters. Instead, it presents a spectrum of entities whose nature reflects distinct philosophical concerns. These beings differ in form, origin, and narrative function, yet they share one defining trait. Their existence challenges assumptions embedded in human cognition. Scholars often group them into three broad categories: cosmic material beings known as the Great Old Ones, metaphysical or universal forces such as the outer gods, and liminal entities that inhabit dreamlike or interstitial realms. Each category contributes a different dimension to the genre's intellectual architecture, and together they outline a cosmology designed to unsettle rather than explain. The Great Old Ones exemplify the collision between biological imagination and ontological uncertainty. These beings, including figures such as Cthulhu, possess material presence yet operate at scales that disrupt comprehension. They are not supernatural in the traditional sense. They obey laws, but not human laws. Their anatomy hints at evolutionary paths unrelated to terrestrial biology, raising questions about the contingency of life itself. Narratives frequently depict them in states of dormancy rather than activity, suggesting that even their sleep exerts influence across continents. This narrative choice reinforces a key philosophical point. The danger lies not in their intention, but in their existence. A being whose mere presence warps geography or cognition embodies the theme of insignificance explored earlier. Humans matter only insofar as they intersect accidentally with processes beyond their conceptual reach. Outer gods, by contrast, represent forces rather than entities. They embody cosmic principles such as entropy, chaos, or the indifference of physical law. Unlike the Great Old Ones, they do not inhabit specific locations and rarely manifest in forms recognizable to human senses. Their influence appears through distortion, decay, or revelation rather than direct encounter. Scholars often cite Nyarlathotep as an intermediary figure, one who bridges the gap between incomprehensible cosmic forces and human perception. Through this role, Nyarlathotep demonstrates how cosmic horror conceptualizes metaphysical agency. The outer gods themselves remain inaccessible, but their presence shapes the universe's structure. They represent a philosophical shift from anthropocentric moral frameworks toward a cosmos governed by forces neither benevolent nor malicious. Their monstrosity arises not from violence, but from the realization that they embody principles underlying reality itself. We must pause to consider how this distinction between embodied and abstract entities enriches the genre. The Great Old Ones challenge assumptions about life and evolution, while the outer gods challenge assumptions about order and meaning. Together, they form a hierarchical model in which human concerns occupy only the lowest tier. This structure mirrors early 20th century scientific cosmology, which positioned humans on an ordinary planet orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable galaxy. Cosmic horror extrapolates this demotion by imagining beings for whom even galaxies appear as minor eddies in a larger cosmic process. Dreamland entities constitute the third major category. These beings inhabit liminal spaces where consciousness and physical reality blur, suggesting that human perception accesses only one layer of a multidimensional continuum. Their existence raises questions about the status of consciousness itself. Are dreams symbolic constructions, neurological misfires, or glimpses of external realities hidden from waking senses? Writers exploit this ambiguity by allowing dream entities to cross into physical space, or by presenting evidence that the dream realm possesses its own geography and history. Such narratives echo psychological theories from the early 20th century, particularly those emphasizing the layered structure of the mind. Yet they extend these theories into metaphysics, implying that the psyche may serve as a portal rather than a boundary. Dreamland entities differ from the other categories in one crucial respect. Their interactions with humans often appear intentional. They guide, mislead, or observe, raising questions about the nature of agency at non-human cognitive scales. This intentionality complicates the philosophical implications. While Great Old Ones ignore humanity and outer gods transcend intention altogether, Dream entities engage with consciousness in ways that destabilize the self. Characters who encounter them often face the erosion of identity, memory, or continuity. The terror lies not in physical danger, but in psychic dissolution. When consciousness becomes permeable, the distinction between internal and external realities collapses, leaving characters unsure whether they confront a monster or an aspect of their own mind refracted through non-human perception. Across these categories, a triadic structure emerges: material incomprehensibility, metaphysical indifference, and psychological permeability. This structure allows the genre to explore different kinds of philosophical dread. Some monsters reveal humanity's insignificance. Others reveal the instability of natural law. Still others reveal the fragility of consciousness. These themes complement rather than contradict one another, illustrating the multidimensional nature of cosmic horror's intellectual project. This examination of entity categories leads naturally into the next subsection, where we explore how humans react when confronted with these beings, and why madness becomes an almost inevitable outcome of such encounters. Human encounters with cosmic horror monsters rarely involve direct conflict. Instead, they expose a deeper philosophical problem. The human mind is structured to interpret reality through scale, causality, and coherence. Yet these beings exist outside those parameters. Madness, therefore, is not a dramatic embellishment, but a narrative instrument that demonstrates the collapse of cognitive frameworks when confronted with phenomena they cannot contain. The breakdown of sanity marks the moment when conceptual tools, memory, language, perception, fail to map onto a world that was never designed for them. This failure is not weakness, but revelation, a shift from misapprehension to unfiltered recognition. Writers often depict madness as a gradual process rather than a sudden event. Characters begin with curiosity, proceed to interpretation, and end in disintegration when interpretation proves impossible. This arc reflects a fundamental tension. Human intelligence evolved to navigate familiar environments, not to comprehend beings who operate outside biological, spatial, or temporal logic. A character might approach a cosmic entity with the confidence of a scientist, only to encounter evidence that empirical reasoning cannot parse. When confronted with geometries that do not behave predictably or sounds that alter cognition, they experience the philosophical equivalent of free fall. The mind does not break from fear. It breaks from an inability to reconcile incompatible realities. The genre's emphasis on madness derives from earlier intellectual developments. By the early 20th century, psychology had begun destabilizing concepts of self and identity. Freud revealed unconscious drives. Jung proposed archetypes shared across cultures. Philosophers questioned whether consciousness reflected truth or constructed it. Cosmic horror transforms these insights into narrative mechanisms. When a character loses their sense of reality, the story dramatizes a philosophical question. What happens when perception encounters something outside the evolutionary boundaries of cognition? The implication is clear. Sanity depends on the stability of patterns. Madness arises when those patterns dissolve. Consider this carefully. Madness in cosmic horror is not an emotional reaction, but an epistemic response. Characters often remain calm even as their perceptions distort. They document their experiences methodically or analyze them with academic rigor. Their collapse comes when they grasp that their frameworks, mathematical, linguistic, or philosophical, are inadequate. A researcher who discovers evidence of non-Euclidean architecture may initially feel fascination. Yet fascination becomes dread when they realize such structures cannot exist within the laws that govern their world. The mind recoils not from danger, but from contradiction. The monster acts as a catalyst, forcing recognition that the universe does not adhere to human logic. Writers frequently depict madness through narrative fragmentation. Diaries trail off. Sentences become incomplete. Descriptions circle around events without naming them. These stylistic shifts signal cognitive destabilization. They also reinforce the theme that language cannot fully articulate the monstrous. Madness becomes both subject and symptom, a demonstration that linguistic forms fail under ontological pressure. This strategy echoes modernist experiments in fractured perspective, but cosmic horror uses fragmentation not to explore psychology alone, but to highlight incompatibility between human consciousness and cosmic reality. Importantly, madness does not always manifest as despair. Some characters respond to cosmic encounters with ecstatic revelation. Their minds do not collapse, they reconfigure. This variant, though less common, reflects the possibility that human cognition might adapt to new orders of reality, albeit at the cost of detaching from human social norms. A figure who becomes devoted to a cosmic entity often appears mad to others, not because they misunderstand reality, but because they adopt a perspective incompatible with shared human frameworks. This raises a subtle philosophical question. Is madness defined by internal dysfunction or by deviation from communal understanding? Cosmic horror leaves the question open, using such characters to complicate the boundaries between sanity and insight. Rhetorical questions naturally arise in this context. What would it mean for a mind to perceive dimensions or temporalities inaccessible to ordinary consciousness? Would such perception constitute madness, or would madness belong to those still confined to limited understanding? These questions have no stable answers, and their irresolution is central to the genre's effect. Madness becomes a mirror held up to human cognition, exposing its limits without offering alternative structures to replace them. One of the genre's most consistent insights is that madness protects as much as it destroys. When perception collapses under the weight of incomprehensible revelation, the mind retreats into distortion, forgetting or misinterpreting what it cannot endure. Madness becomes a defensive structure, shielding consciousness from truths that would otherwise shatter it entirely. Narratives often gesture to this paradox, suggesting that ignorance, not knowledge, preserves the stability of the self. A character who glimpses a cosmic entity might survive precisely because their memory disintegrates. They emerge damaged but intact, bearing scars where comprehension should have been. Across these narratives, madness functions as the human cost of encountering beings that operate beyond biological and conceptual design. It dramatizes the tension between curiosity and limitation, revealing a world in which the desire for understanding collides with the structural boundaries of cognition. Human-monster interactions therefore do not hinge on violence or domination, but on the failure of interpretation itself. This examination prepares us for the next subsection, where the theme of forbidden knowledge deepens these dynamics by showing how attempts to understand the monstrous often accelerate the collapse of worldviews and meaning systems. Forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror is not dangerous because it reveals secrets the powerful wish to hide. It is dangerous because it exposes structures of reality that human cognition is not equipped to process. When characters encounter ancient manuscripts, anomalous equations, or archaeological impossibilities, they confront information that destabilizes the basic assumptions through which the mind organizes experience. Such knowledge does not merely contradict prior beliefs. It dismantles the categories that make belief possible. Understanding becomes a form of injury, and comprehension a catalyst for collapse. Writers often frame forbidden knowledge as an intellectual pursuit. Scholars, archaeologists, and researchers approach mysteries with confidence in methodological rigor. Their downfall begins when familiar tools, language, mathematics, empirical observation, fail to contain what they discover. A linguist who translates a fragmentary inscription may find that the text describes physical laws incompatible with known cosmology. A scientist analyzing an artifact might discover matter older than the solar system, yet shaped with deliberate precision. These discoveries appear solvable at first, but each step toward clarity reveals deeper contradiction. Forbidden knowledge thus operates as a recursive trap. The closer one approaches understanding, the more violently existing paradigms disintegrate. This dynamic reflects a central philosophical theme. Since the Enlightenment, Western thought has prized the acquisition of knowledge as inherently beneficial. Cosmic horror reverses this assumption. Knowledge becomes corrosive, not liberating. It destabilizes rather than elevates. The genre suggests that ignorance is not a deficit, but a structural necessity, a protective barrier between the human mind and forces it cannot interpret safely. When narratives warn that humanity was not meant to know, they are not articulating moral prohibition, but cognitive limitation. The mind collapses not because the truth is evil, but because it is incompatible with the architecture of thought. Consider this carefully. Forbidden knowledge does not announce itself as such. Characters identify it only in retrospect, after the collapse has begun. Initially, the pursuit feels rational, even noble. The turning point occurs when the information begins reorganizing perception. A researcher studying a non-Euclidean sculpture may suddenly perceive spatial distortions outside the laboratory. A historian reading an ancient chronicle may begin dreaming of events predating human civilization. These shifts indicate that the knowledge is not passive. It infringes upon cognition, suggesting that certain truths exert an active influence simply by being grasped. This notion echoes early 20th century debates about whether language shapes thought or merely describes it. In cosmic horror, the answer leans decisively toward shaping. Once new concepts enter the mind, they restructure the interpretive grid through which reality appears. Epistemic collapse, the final stage of forbidden knowledge, is not a moment of revelation, but a process of unraveling. It manifests through shifts in temporality, identity, and spatial understanding. Characters lose the ability to distinguish present from past, self from other, interior from exterior. This breakdown reflects a philosophical critique of humanism. The stable self is a construct dependent on orderly perception. When perception becomes incoherent, so does the self. The collapse therefore reveals the fragility of personal identity. Madness, discussed earlier, becomes the experiential expression of this collapse, but the underlying mechanism is epistemological rather than emotional. Writers highlight this collapse through structural choices. Narratives may begin as academic reports, travel journals, or scientific analyses before dissolving into fragmented entries or abrupt silences. This formal shift mirrors the cognitive erosion occurring within the narrator. Such techniques echo modernist experimentation, but serve a distinct purpose. They demonstrate that forbidden knowledge destabilizes not only characters, but the narratives they attempt to construct. When a story can no longer sustain coherent structure, the breakdown signals truth exceeding representation. The text itself becomes evidence of epistemic failure. One striking pattern across these works is the paradoxical allure of forbidden knowledge. Characters often recognize the danger yet persist in their investigations, driven by intellectual compulsion. This reflects a broader human tendency, the desire to transcend limitations, to understand what lies beyond the visible horizon. Cosmic horror turns this desire against itself. Knowledge becomes a form of temptation, similar to the mythic motif of the forbidden book or the prescribed revelation. Yet the genre departs from traditional morality tales. The danger is not divine punishment, but cognitive incompatibility. A character who learns too much becomes unable to return to a prior state of ignorance, even if madness has already begun to erode their grasp on reality. Rhetorical questions frequently appear in critical discussions of this theme, because the genre invites reflection on the limits of inquiry. What would it mean for a truth to be cognitively lethal? Can understanding itself become a form of contamination? These questions highlight the philosophical stakes of forbidden knowledge. They also reveal why cosmic horror maintains its power across decades. The fear it cultivates is not of monsters in the dark, but of truths that destabilize the structures by which the mind interprets darkness itself. Triadic patterns also recur in how forbidden knowledge presents itself: artifacts, texts, and revelations. Artifacts embody material impossibility. Texts encode conceptual threat. Revelations occur when perception expands involuntarily. Together, these three forms map the pathways through which epistemic collapse unfolds. Each represents a different mode of encountering the monstrous: physical, linguistic, and cognitive, yet all lead toward the same outcome: the disintegration of conceptual stability. The genre's deepest insight emerges here. Forbidden knowledge terrifies because it forces recognition that human understanding is provisional, not comprehensive. The universe remains vast, intricate, and resistant to simplification. Cosmic monsters embody this resistance by existing beyond conceptual categorization. When humans attempt to grasp them, the mind must either distort the truth or distort itself. The earliest appearances of philosophically terrifying cosmic monsters reveal a gradual movement away from folkloric supernaturalism toward a distinctly modern form of existential unease. 19th century writers such as Arthur Machen, Robert W. Chambers, and Algernon Blackwood established the foundation, though they did so indirectly. Their creations were rarely described in detail. Instead, they emerged as disturbances in perception and reason. Machen's The Great God Pan, 1894, for instance, presents an encounter not with a visible monster, but with a revelation that fractures identity. Early in the text, the narrator warns that the event left the mind blinded rather than the eyes, a phrase that anticipates later stories in which the monstrous acts primarily on cognition. This shift, from creature to concept, marks the first connective thread linking these early works to the fully articulated cosmic entities that would appear in the 20th century. The transition becomes clearer with Chambers' The King in Yellow, 1895, a collection unified by a fictional play whose mere reading destabilizes sanity. The monster in this cycle is not a figure, but a force, the text itself. In one passage, a character laments, "I cannot forget Carcosa, though I know it cannot. Be real," suggesting a blurring of mental and external landscapes. The horror arises from epistemic violation rather than physical threat. While later mythmakers would populate Carcosa with entities and dynastic structures, Chambers introduces the idea that the monstrous may reside not in form, but in contagion, the spread of knowledge that dissolves conceptual boundaries. This concept becomes a central pillar of the mythos as it evolves. Blackwood's The Willows, 1907, further refines the framework by depicting beings that never fully manifest. The narrator insinuates their presence through natural distortions, a sound that was not the wind, a movement that was not the river, and concludes that the entities exist in a dimension adjacent to ordinary perception. The interstitial quality of these beings anticipates the later distinction between material and metaphysical monsters. Their function is to reveal ontological permeability, suggesting that reality contains layers only partially accessible to human senses. This idea becomes a recurring motif in 20th century cosmic horror, linking Blackwood's atmospheric tale to later mythological developments. These early works share a commitment to ambiguity, yet they differ in narrative emphasis. Machen prioritizes psychological rupture. Chambers foregrounds textual contagion. Blackwood explores spatial instability. When H.P. Lovecraft began writing in the 1910s and 1920s, he synthesized these threads and expanded them into a coherent cosmology. His stories introduce named entities, most famously Cthulhu, yet the narrative focus remains on what these beings signify. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, the creature appears only briefly. The bulk of the narrative concerns fragments, a bas-relief depicting a pulpy, tentacled head, maritime reports, and the delirious notes of a deceased professor. The structure mirrors earlier fragmentary techniques, but amplifies them through accumulating evidence. The monster functions as a gravitational center around which these documents orbit. Its significance emerges not through direct confrontation, but through textual resonance across sources. Intertext connections also appear in Lovecraft's use of recurring locations, artifacts, and scholarly figures. The Necronomicon, introduced as an obscure medieval text, reappears across stories, lending continuity and historical depth. Arkham, Innsmouth, and Miskatonic University form a geographic and institutional network that contextualizes encounters with cosmic beings. This interconnectedness represents an evolution from the isolated horrors of Machen and Blackwood. Whereas earlier tales depict singular disruptions, Lovecraft's fiction suggests a systemic cosmology in which monstrous forces permeate global and historical structures. The monsters become nodes within a vast, partially visible network of meaning. We must pause to consider how this evolution reflects broader literary trends. Modernism's emphasis on fragmentation and uncertainty influenced the narrative strategies of early cosmic horror. In turn, cosmic horror contributed to modernism by articulating anxieties about language, perception, and the limits of rationality. These stories mirror scientific developments as well. Non-Euclidean geometry, quantum indeterminacy, and expanding astronomical horizons provided metaphors for entities whose nature resists containment. Early descriptions of cosmic monsters often include geometric distortions, angles that behave incorrectly, distances that collapse unexpectedly, underscoring the destabilization of spatial and cognitive norms. Intertextual development continues with August Derleth and later mythos contributors, though often through reinterpretation rather than invention. Derleth attempted to impose moral categories onto the mythos, positioning entities as forces of elemental polarity. This reinterpretation reveals how cosmic monsters resist simplistic classification. When forced into moral frameworks, they lose philosophical potency. Later writers such as Carl Edward Wagner and Thomas Ligotti returned to themes of existential dread and cognitive rupture, preserving the intellectual lineage established in early works. Their contributions highlight the adaptability of cosmic monsters. Although specific entities may change, the underlying conceptual architecture remains stable. The earliest appearances of cosmic monsters thus form a lattice of narrative experimentation. Each story contributes a different facet: psychological fragmentation, textual contagion, spatial distortion, systemic cosmology, and later writers weave these facets into more expansive mythic structures. The monsters evolve not through increased physical description, but through deepening philosophical articulation. Their power lies in the connections between texts, in the sense that each narrative uncovers another layer of a reality too vast to grasp. This prepares us for the next subsection, where we examine a major story case study to see how these conceptual threads operate within a single narrative frame. A useful way to understand the philosophical function of cosmic monsters is to examine how a single narrative organizes fear around knowledge, perception, and scale. One of the most influential examples is the tale of the submerged entity whose awakening disturbs global consciousness, a story structured not around confrontation, but around documentation, inference, and collapse. The narrative begins with an academic executor sorting through the papers of a recently deceased scholar, a framing device that immediately signals the documentary approach characteristic of early cosmic horror. The monster itself does not appear until the final pages. Its presence accumulates gradually through fragments, testimonies, and clues. What emerges is not a creature in the conventional sense, but a conceptual disturbance so vast that even indirect evidence destabilizes those who encounter it. A central narrative device in this story is the sculpted bas relief discovered among the scholar's possessions. The young artist who created it claims to have no memory of the process, describing instead a series of dreams in which a colossal thing rose from green-black depths, its shape obscured by a geometry that would not remain still. This description does not attempt to convey anatomy, it conveys disorientation. The sculpture functions as a material intrusion of the incomprehensible into everyday life, a motif that appears throughout the genre. Its significance grows as other documents reveal similar dreams reported in distant parts of the world during the same period. Such synchronicity suggests influence without intention, a philosophical shift from monster as agent to monster as field, an ambient force causing distortions simply by existing. The second major fragment comes from a police inspector in Louisiana, investigating a ritualistic gathering among a remote community. His report includes a chant describing a sleeping being whose thoughts press against human minds. The language used is deliberately unstable, mixing phonetic approximations with untranslated syllables. Its effect is to imply the collision of cultural memory with something radically non-human. The inspector admits, "I felt no malice in the air, only a pressure, as though my senses strained against the edges of a truth they could not receive." This line reveals a key narrative function. Fear arises not from threat, but from recognition of perceptual limits. The chant and its associated iconography widen the story's scope, situating the dream phenomena within a global pattern of partial recollection. A maritime account provides the narrative climax. Sailors on an isolated voyage encounter a risen island, a geological impossibility that appears without warning. Their logs describe architecture marked by angles that behaved like hinges between dimensions rather than joints between stones. The crew's encounter with the dormant entity, brief, confused, and catastrophic, illustrates the genre's commitment to perceptual disruption. Even at the moment of revelation, the narrative avoids definitive description. Instead, it emphasizes the failure of sensory processing, surfaces that shift when looked at directly, proportions that vary with approach, and sounds that alter thought rather than hearing. The sailors' terror stems from the discovery that reality is not stable. Their final notes describe the island sinking again, leaving no trace except trauma and a scattered manuscript. We must pause here to consider the narrative architecture. The story never presents a first-person encounter with the monster. Instead, it layers documents from individuals who themselves worked from incomplete understanding. This structure transforms the protagonist into an archivist rather than a hero. His task is synthesis, and synthesis becomes perilous because the fragments align into something that should not be knowable. The story dramatizes epistemic peril. Combining information becomes its own form of confrontation. As the narrator remarks near the end, what remains unknown may preserve us. What becomes clear may end us. This line articulates the philosophical tension at the heart of the text. The monster's function within the story is multifold. First, it embodies scale. Its awakening causes psychological disturbances across continents, implying a mind capable of imprinting onto human consciousness inadvertently. Second, it represents geological and temporal vastness. Its slumber predates human civilization, and its periodic stirrings align not with human chronology, but with cosmic rhythms. Third, it reveals the fragility of the human conceptual framework. Those who encounter signs of its existence do not die because they are attacked. They collapse because their worldview cannot accommodate the implications. The monster is not antagonist, but evidence, proof that humanity's sense of order rests on provisional assumptions. Intertextually, this story plays a foundational role in shaping the larger mythos. Later writers expand the marine cult, the global dream phenomena, and the notion of cyclical awakenings. Others reinterpret the island encounter as part of a broader geological pattern tied to shifting dimensions. The narrative's emphasis on documentation over action provides a template widely imitated. The cosmic monster becomes a distributed presence, accessible only through clues scattered across disciplines: anthropology, geology, psychology, folklore. This distribution reinforces the idea that the monstrous is not a singular event, but a systemic condition. The story's enduring influence lies in its ability to fuse mythic scale with modern anxieties about knowledge. It demonstrates that horror can arise from intellectual synthesis rather than sensory shock. The monster is terrifying because it clarifies rather than obscures, revealing that human understanding occupies only a narrow band of possibility. Its conceptual framework laid the groundwork for countless later narratives, all of which inherit the tension between curiosity and collapse. This prepares us for the next subsection, where a second major story case study illustrates how other writers adapted and expanded these narrative strategies to explore different facets of cosmic monstrosity. A second major case study reveals how cosmic horror shifts when the monster is not a slumbering, planetary-scale intelligence, but a being whose presence erodes meaning through manipulation rather than magnitude. The clearest example is the wandering, many-masked figure who appears across continents and centuries, altering perception, guiding cults, and orchestrating events with motives never articulated. Although presented as a single entity, Nyarlathotep functions less as a character than as a narrative principle, an agent of epistemic disorientation who exposes the instability of identity, culture, and truth itself. His role in the 1920 prose poem sequence Nyarlathotep provides an illuminating contrast to the documentary structure of the earlier case study. The text opens with a world already sliding into unease. The narrator describes rumors that the pharaoh has come again, accompanied by inexplicable electrical failures, collapsing social order, and visions seen across multiple cities. Notably, the narrative never confirms whether these events are supernatural, psychological, or socio-political. Ambiguity itself becomes the medium of horror. Nyarlathotep's demonstrations, part science exhibition, part ritual performance, blend technology with metaphysics. Audiences witness impossible projections, hear sounds that alter emotion, and experience visions that dissolve the boundary between memory and imagination. One observer writes, "I seem to see myself from angles not meant for flesh," a line that encapsulates the entity's characteristic distortion of embodied perception. Unlike the submerged colossus examined in subsection 3.2, Nyarlathotep does not require geological upheaval or cosmic alignment. He requires attention. His influence spreads through crowds, rhetoric, spectacle. This shift reflects a different philosophical concern. Truth is not merely fragile, but manipulable. When Nyarlathotep travels from city to city, people willingly attend his demonstrations, trusting the structure of public performance. Their collapse is therefore an indictment of epistemic vulnerability. Humans accept as real whatever appears within familiar social frameworks. The story exploits this tendency by presenting Nyarlathotep as both showman and prophet, a figure who uses recognizable forms to deliver content that exceeds comprehension. The narrative's final sequence is particularly revealing. As the crowds disperse into Ditiputsitubap, the night, they become separated, lost, or transformed. The narrator finds himself wandering through a landscape that shifts from urban to primordial without transition. He observes companions marching into darkness, with faces calm as statues, as though their agency has dissolved. No direct harm occurs. Instead, perception fractures. The world the narrator knew no longer adheres to consistent logic. Buildings appear at impossible angles, streets widen into deserts, and stars rearrange themselves into unfamiliar constellations. Here, the entity's role becomes clear. Nyarlathotep is a catalyst for epistemic collapse at the societal scale. His presence unravels the conceptual scaffolding that supports shared reality. We must pause to analyze how narrative structure supports this effect. Unlike the archival accumulation of The Call of Cthulhu, this story unfolds in real time, adopting a fever dream rhythm that mirrors the narrator's disorientation. The language grows, progressively unstable. Early paragraphs rely on journalistic observation, while later ones drift into symbolic description. Sentences extend, compress, or repeat in ways that mimic cognitive distortion. The style itself becomes evidence of the monster's influence. This technique demonstrates how formal shifts can encode thematic content without explicit exposition. Intertext connections amplify Nyarlathotep's significance. Later mythos stories present him as the emissary or manifestation of forces that cannot communicate directly, a being who can adopt human form without sharing human constraints. This interpretive trajectory reframes the prose poem as an early glimpse into a much larger metaphysical system. Nyarlathotep becomes the interface between cosmic indifference and human vulnerability. His multiplicity of masks symbolizes the instability of identity, while his demonstrations expose the fragility of empirical confidence. The entity thus bridges psychological horror and cosmic horror, showing how the collapse of meaning can arise not only from incomprehensible scale, but from deliberate distortion. Critics frequently note that Nyarlathotep is the most active figure in the mythos. He travels, speaks, chooses, intervenes. Yet his agency remains opaque. Is he experimenting, revealing, destroying? His motives are never stabilized, and this absence becomes part of the terror. A monster with a motive, however alien, can be interpreted. A monster whose actions have effects but no decipherable purpose becomes an existential puzzle. His narrative function, therefore, is not to attack but to demonstrate. He reveals that meaning, coherence, and collective sanity are precarious achievements rather than guarantees. The evolution of this concept in later literature further underscores his importance. Writers such as Thomas Ligotti reinterpret the idea of the manipulative cosmic presence through modern philosophical pessimism, presenting entities that expose consciousness itself as a trap. Others emphasize the political dimension, casting Nyarlathotep-like figures as embodiments of authoritarian rhetoric or technological coercion. These expansions demonstrate the entity's adaptability. Because he symbolizes instability rather than mass, he can be reinterpreted across contexts without losing his philosophical potency. In summary, this case study shows a different face of cosmic horror. Where the first examined scale and geological vastness, this one examines consciousness and manipulation. The monster becomes a test of interpretive resilience, revealing how easily coherent worlds collapse when a force understands human cognition better than humans understand themselves. The mythos surrounding philosophically terrifying cosmic monsters did not remain fixed after its early formulations. Instead, it evolved through a long process of collaboration, reinterpretation, resistance, and reinvention. This evolution is significant because it reveals how later writers grappled with the conceptual challenges embedded in the original works. The rejection of moral binaries, the refusal of anthropocentric cosmology, and the emphasis on epistemic instability. Each contributor altered the mythos in ways that reflected their own philosophical commitments, producing a layered tradition that continues to shape cosmic horror today. The most influential early collaborator was August Derleth, whose role as editor, publisher, and systematizer gave him immense influence over how later readers understood the mythos. Derleth approached the material with a desire for order. Where earlier works emphasized ambiguity, he introduced structure. Where the original monsters embodied indifference, he imposed intention. His attempt to classify cosmic entities into elemental categories, air, earth, fire, water, reveals this impulse towards systemization. For Derleth, cosmic beings aligned with directional forces and engaged in struggles reminiscent of traditional good versus evil narratives. This reinterpretation stands in tension with the philosophical core of earlier cosmic horror, which depicted a universe without moral architecture. Yet Derleth's approach achieved something important. It transformed the mythos into a shared vocabulary capable of supporting new stories, even if those stories shifted tone and meaning. Critics often argue that Derleth's system diminishes the original philosophical implications, and this tension reflects a broader dilemma in collaborative myth-making. Cosmic horror resists categorization by design. Its monsters derive their potency from unclassifiable strangeness. When contributors attempt to rationalize or codify them, they inevitably narrow the conceptual space in which they operate. Nevertheless, Derleth's contributions preserved and disseminated earlier works at a time when they risked slipping into obscurity. Without his efforts at Arkham House, many foundational texts would not have reached later writers who revitalized the genre. Thus, even though his interpretive framework diverges from the original vision, his role in the mythos is structurally indispensable. Later authors responded to Derleth's system in different ways. Some accepted it, building stories around the elemental and moral schema he proposed. Others rejected it, returning to the ambiguity and philosophical disorientation characteristic of earlier cosmic horror. Writers such as Ramsey Campbell, operating in the 1960s and 1970s, developed their own regional mythologies while maintaining the underlying theme of epistemic dread. Campbell's entities often appear as distortions of urban landscape or memory, aligning more closely with the psychological instability seen in Nyarlathotep. His expansions demonstrate how cosmic horror could adapt to contemporary environments, shifting from remote islands and ancient manuscripts to industrial decay and suburban claustrophobia. Catherine Kurtz, Bryan, Lumley, and others brought additional reinterpretations. Some focused on occult frameworks, others emphasized militaristic or technological encounters. These variations reveal the elasticity of cosmic horror. Because the genre is defined more by epistemological rupture than by specific creatures, its monsters can migrate across cultural contexts without losing their thematic resonance. Lumley, for instance, introduced figures who could confront cosmic forces directly, a departure from earlier stories where confrontation inevitably led to collapse. His approach reframes the monsters not as impossible, but as overwhelming, shifting the tone from philosophical terror to heroic struggle. While this interpretation diverges from the original thematic structure, it shows how later writers transformed cosmic entities into versatile narrative tools. A particularly important development occurred when writers began questioning the anthropocentric perspective embedded even in earlier cosmic horror. Thomas Ligotti represents the most radical strand of this evolution. His stories replace monstrous entities with philosophical propositions. For Ligotti, the true cosmic horror lies in consciousness itself. External monsters become metaphors for internal collapse, and epistemic dread emerges not from beings beyond comprehension, but from the realization that human subjectivity is fundamentally unstable. Ligotti's work draws implicitly from earlier ideas about forbidden knowledge and cognitive limitation, but reframes them through contemporary pessimism. His monsters rarely appear in physical form. Instead, they manifest as philosophical arguments embodied in landscape, language, or perception. This shift moves the mythos away from shared cosmology toward individualized psychological crisis. Other authors expanded the mythos through stylistic experimentation. Caitlin R. Kiernan, for example, integrates paleontology, deep time, and queer identity into stories where monsters serve as catalysts for existential recognition rather than sources of terror alone. Her entities are not villains, but truths, revelations that alter the protagonist's relationship to the world. Kiernan's work demonstrates how cosmic horror can incorporate scientific discourse while retaining its commitment to ambiguity. The monsters do not signify divine wrath or moral judgment. They signify the limits of human frameworks for interpreting geological and biological history. We must pause here to consider a crucial point. Collaboration within cosmic horror does not produce a unified mythology. Instead, it generates a constellation of interpretations, each emphasizing different aspects of the original philosophical structure. Some highlight scale, others highlight cognition. Still others highlight identity, agency, or cultural disintegration. This multiplicity is not fragmentation, it is evolution. The monsters persist because they are conceptually open, resistant to definitive, meaning capable of absorbing new anxieties as cultural contexts shift. Video games, role-playing systems, and film adaptations expanded the mythos even further in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Games such as Call of Cthulhu emphasize investigative collapse, while films frequently adopt the visual language of impossible geometry and non-human movement to evoke the monstrous. These adaptations demonstrate that cosmic horror's philosophical essence can survive translation into sensory media, provided the monster remains less a creature than a disruption, something that breaks the viewer's confidence in perception, logic, or narrative stability. In summary, the collaborative evolution of cosmic horror reveals a tension that defines the genre: the desire to systematize versus the necessity of ambiguity. Derleth organized the mythos, Campbell destabilized it, Ligotti internalized it, Kiernan expanded it through science. Later media adapted it through imagery. Through these transformations, the cosmic monster remains a philosophical event rather than a fixed entity. Cosmic horror monsters did not remain confined to fiction. They migrated into modern folklore, internet culture, and pseudo-documentary communities that treat these beings as semi-plausible presences rather than purely literary inventions. This migration reveals something enduring about the human imagination. When a concept exposes the limits of understanding, it becomes fertile territory for myth-making. The monsters persist not because they promise spectacle, but because they blur the boundary between narrative possibility and epistemic uncertainty. In a cultural moment defined by fragmented information and algorithmic echo chambers, cosmic entities become symbolic placeholders for the unknown, the unseen, and the unverified. Early 20th century readers occasionally wrote letters suggesting that stories of submerged cities or wandering gods resembled real visions, dreams, or ancestral memories. These reactions were not the product of gullibility, but of cultural context. During the 1920s and 1930s, spiritualism, archaeology, and occult revivalism coexisted uneasily with rapid scientific change. Reports of strange lights, mysterious artifacts, and inexplicable phenomena circulated widely in newspapers. Fictional monsters slipped easily into this landscape of uncertainty. Even decades later, some enthusiasts point to anomalous geological formations or sudden mass hallucination events as evidence that cosmic entities may underlie unexplained historical narratives. The persistence of these claims reveals how cosmic horror merges seamlessly with traditions of speculative anthropology and lost civilization lore. The internet amplified this dynamic dramatically. Online forums devoted to paranormal sightings, creepypasta archives, and folklore channels frequently incorporate mythos terminology, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unconsciously. A user might describe a dream involving a towering, tentacled silhouette rising from the ocean, unaware that the image replicates a century-old literary motif. Others report auditory hallucinations resembling non-human chanting, echoing chants described in the earliest cosmic horror tales. These sightings are rarely malicious in intent. They reflect the genre's infiltration into the shared vocabulary of the strange. When individuals confront ambiguous sensory experiences, they reach for narratives that give structure without offering resolution. Cosmic horror provides precisely that. a language of indeterminacy capable of absorbing unexplained impressions without collapsing into explanation. Hoaxes also play a role in sustaining these myths. Photographs doctored to depict colossal shadows and fog banks, videos showing distorted animal shapes, and fabricated archaeological discoveries circulate widely on social platforms. These hoaxes succeed not because they appear authentic, but because they tap into a cultural desire for liminal encounters. Viewers understand on some level that the images are manipulated, yet they allow themselves to entertain the implications. The hoax becomes a ritualized act of speculation. It does not ask, "Is this real?" but rather, "What if reality contains gaps where such things might exist?" In this way, the hoax embodies the genre's central philosophy. The world is larger than its explanations. We must pause here to consider why this phenomenon persists despite widespread skepticism. Cosmic monsters flourish in cultural spaces marked by ambiguity. They resonate during periods when scientific progress outpaces conceptual assimilation. When discoveries in astrophysics, neuroscience, or quantum mechanics reveal aspects of the universe that defy intuitive understanding. In such contexts, people turn not to traditional demons or hauntings, but to entities representing ontological vastness. A deep-sea anomaly evokes submerged, cosmic beings. Unexplained radio bursts inspire speculation about non-human intelligences. Sleep paralysis visions become framed through the lens of extra-dimensional contact. Cosmic horror provides a modern mythic grammar for experiences that resist ordinary categorization. The genre's influence extends into unsolved mystery communities as well. Investigators exploring disappearances, anomalous weather events, or archaeological puzzles sometimes invoke cosmic frameworks as speculative explanations. While presented tongue-in-cheek, these suggestions demonstrate how cosmic horror has entered the collective repertoire of possible but unprovable ideas. In these communities, the monster is less a creature than a conceptual placeholder, a way to articulate the discomfort of not knowing. The openness of the mythos allows it to adapt to new contexts. Whether examining petroglyphs, electromagnetic anomalies, or unverified historical accounts, participants use cosmic horror language to mark the limits of certainty. Urban legends also borrow from cosmic horror. Stories of cities that appear briefly on the horizon, islands that surface only during specific tides, or figures who change shape when viewed indirectly, circulate widely in rural and suburban settings. These legends lack explicit reference to established mythos entities, yet they replicate the genre's core features: impossible geography, perceptual instability, and indifference to human understanding. Such stories persist because they convert abstract anxieties about ecological change, technological dependence, or social fragmentation into tangible narrative forms. The persistence of cosmic horror in myth, hoax, and sighting culture reflects a universal human theme: the desire to locate meaning at the edge of comprehension. People encounter ambiguous or overwhelming phenomena and instinctively reach for frameworks that acknowledge uncertainty. Cosmic horror supplies a language that neither clarifies nor dismisses. It leaves space for speculation, dread, and curiosity. The monsters become metaphors for everything unarticulated: psychological, ecological, scientific. The implications remain open-ended. Whether these sightings reflect genuine belief, playful engagement, or attempts to navigate conceptual dissonance, their proliferation suggests that cosmic horror speaks to a persistent cultural condition. The monsters thrive not because they might exist, but because they articulate what existence fails to explain. Cosmic horror's philosophically terrifying monsters have proven remarkably adaptable across visual and interactive media, even though these monsters were originally designed to resist depiction entirely. Filmmakers, game designers, and musicians confront a paradox. How does one represent beings defined by their incompatibility with representation? The solutions vary: strategic obscurity, sensory distortion, environmental storytelling, but they all reveal a shared understanding that cosmic horror thrives not in what is shown, but in what cannot be fully rendered. These adaptations illuminate why the genre persists across formats, each medium discovering new ways to articulate the terror of an indifferent universe. Film provides the most visible arena for this negotiation. Because cinema traditionally relies on concrete imagery, the challenge lies in depicting the monstrous without diminishing its conceptual force. Directors often address this by shifting focus from the monster itself to its effects on perception. In works loosely inspired by mythos logic, such as distorted landscapes, impossible movements, or psychologically fracturing encounters, the camera behaves as though it too suffers epistemic disruption. Walls bend beyond Euclidean geometry, shadows stretch against light. Audio becomes dissonant, layering natural and unnatural frequencies. These choices echo descriptions in early cosmic fiction, where the narrator insists that the terror lies not in the creature's form, but in the mind's failure to interpret it. The screen becomes a medium of cognitive malfunction. We must pause here to note a recurring technique: withholding. Filmmakers frequently restrict the viewer's access to the monster. When glimpses do appear, they are brief, unstable, or obscured by water, fog, or darkness. This approach mirrors the documentary layering in earlier texts, suggestion instead of certainty. It also acknowledges a central principle of cosmic horror. Any fully defined image imposes limitations. Any partial image preserves conceptual immensity. A creature glimpsed only in silhouette maintains its philosophical implications far more effectively than one rendered through prolonged digital animation. Interactive media, especially video games, offer a different mode of engagement. Games adapt cosmic horror not through depiction, but through player disempowerment. Titles drawing inspiration from mythos logic place players in environments where navigation, logic, and survival depend on systems designed to fail. Corridors shift layout unexpectedly. Physics behave inconsistently. The act of turning a corner may reveal a geometry incompatible with earlier observations. These games borrow heavily from the sensory instability described in foundational texts. Rather than encouraging mastery, they cultivate disorientation. The monster becomes environmental rather than individual, a condition of the world rather than a creature within it. One influential tabletop adaptation, the role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, introduced mechanics that embody epistemic collapse. Players possess not only health, but sanity, a resource depleted when encountering phenomena beyond human conceptual capacity. This mechanic translates philosophical dread into gameplay structure. Knowledge literally costs stability. Understanding becomes a strategic liability. The game's endurance across decades reflects how powerfully this mechanic resonates with players. It externalizes a theme central to cosmic horror. Comprehension is dangerous, yet curiosity compels pursuit. Unlike traditional heroic games, Call of Cthulhu treats victory not as defeating the monster, but delaying enlightenment. Music and sound art offer yet another interpretive path. Composers working within dark ambient, drone, and experimental genres often seek to evoke scale and indifference through soundscapes rather than melody. Their works feature sustained tones, distorted field recordings, and frequencies that create physical discomfort. These auditory strategies replicate the pressure frequently described in early cosmic fiction, the sense that something vast and silent exerts influence without revealing itself. Live performances sometimes incorporate ritualistic pacing, minimal lighting, or spatialized audio, transforming the listening environment into an analog of cosmic disorientation. The monster becomes a vibration rather than an image. Modern musicians also draw inspiration from mythic elements. Album titles reference dreamlands, forgotten cities, or beings that dwell in interstitial spaces. Lyrics and spoken word passages adopt the cadence of academic fragments or archaeological speculation, echoing the documentary styles of early texts. Even when not directly referencing specific mythos entities, the works participate in the same philosophical inquiry. How does one represent what exceeds representation? In this way, music becomes cosmic horror's most abstract vehicle, engaging listeners not through narrative but through conceptual affect. Across these media, the adaptations highlight universal human concerns. Audiences gravitate toward cosmic horror, not simply for fright, but for frameworks that articulate contemporary anxieties about technological acceleration, ecological uncertainty, and the limits of scientific explanation. Films depicting collapsing reality mirror fears about misinformation and sensory overload. Games that undermine player agency resonate with cultural worries about systems too complex for individual comprehension. Music that evokes vastness without structure reflects the disorientation of navigating a world defined by infinite data and diminishing clarity. The persistence of cosmic horror across media suggests that the monsters endure because they symbolize unresolved tensions rather than fixed threats. They embody the recognition that human understanding remains provisional, fragile, and easily ruptured. Each adaptation medium discovers new ways to express this fragility, transforming conceptual dread into sensory experience without closing off interpretation. The implications remain open. Whether cosmic horror thrives in visual suggestion, interactive instability, or auditory abstraction, its monsters continue migrating across cultural forms because they articulate something essential about the modern condition. The world may contain structures, forces, or intelligences that remain outside all human maps, and art in any medium circles those absences without ever filling them. Cosmic horror's most philosophically terrifying monsters have undergone a peculiar transformation in the subcultural and academic imagination. What began as literary devices for expressing the inadequacy of human understanding has evolved into a shared intellectual playground where occultists, internet theorists, literary critics, philosophers, and collaborative fiction communities reinterpret these entities as metaphors, symbols, and conceptual tools. The result is not mere fandom, but a multi-layered cultural afterlife in which the monsters serve as frameworks for thinking about cognition, society, ideology, and the boundaries of reality itself. Each community, knowingly or not, extends the original project, articulating the unsettling idea that human beings encounter reality only partially and perhaps inaccurately. Occult-adjacent groups were among the IED first to appropriate cosmic horror into their symbolic systems. Despite the creators' explicit insistence that the monsters were fictional, some practitioners integrate these entities into ritual language or psychological frameworks. Their approach is rarely literal. Rather, cosmic entities become allegories for confronting the unknown. Rituals invoking the outer darkness or the God without form emulate the emotional posture found in early cosmic fiction, acknowledging immensity while maintaining interpretative distance. These practitioners are not attempting to summon monstrous beings, but to ritualize epistemic humility, using the mythic grammar of cosmic horror as a means of cultivating altered states or exploring the psyche's shadowed terrains. The cosmic monster becomes a mirror rather than a metaphysical claim. Online collaborative fiction communities represent another form of appropriation. Forums dedicated to speculative world-building, analog horror, and creepypasta often incorporate cosmic motifs without referencing specific mythos names. Users create entities that manipulate perception, inhabit impossible spaces, or erode cognitive boundaries. These creations resemble their literary ancestors not because they imitate them directly, but because the underlying philosophical concerns persist. The struggle to express what cannot be understood. Participants contribute diary fragments, mock field reports, and pseudo-anthropological essays, collectively constructing universes that replicate the documentary aesthetic of early cosmic texts. The monster becomes decentralized, its identity distributed across multiple perspectives and mediums. Meme culture, surprisingly, plays its own role in sustaining these ideas. The image of an incomprehensible being placed alongside humorous captions may seem to trivialize cosmic horror, yet the humor often hinges on recognition of the concept's deeper implications. Jokes about gazing into the void, or accidentally summoning something from beyond the ninth dimension, function as shorthand for social and psychological overwhelm. The cosmic monster becomes a metaphor for the absurdity of modern existence, bureaucracy, technological overload, emotional burnout. In this context, the humor does not diminish the philosophical weight. Rather, it acknowledges it indirectly, transforming dread into communal coping. Academic discourse approaches cosmic horror from a different angle, treating these monsters as artifacts of cultural anxiety. Literary scholars examine how the entities express concerns about scientific uncertainty, colonial encounters, or the instability of perception. Mythographers explore the ways cosmic horror synthesizes ancient creation myths with modern cosmology, producing a hybrid mythology that speaks to contemporary dislocation. Philosophers of mind consider cosmic entities as metaphors for the limits of cognition, echoing arguments from phenomenology and epistemology. If the mind evolved for survival rather than truth, what entire categories of reality might lie beyond its reach? In this view, the monster is not a creature, but a thought experiment, revealing the boundaries of the human conceptual apparatus. Posthumanist theorists push this further, interpreting cosmic horror as an early expression of ideas that now dominate technological discourse. Non-human intelligence, distributed agency, and the possibility that consciousness is not unique but incidental. For these scholars, the monster symbolizes a world no longer centered on human experience. It embodies the unsettling shift from anthropocentrism to planetary scale systems, ecological, computational, or cosmological. The dread arises not from a malevolent entity, but from the realization that human beings are neither necessary nor structurally privileged participants in reality. Anthropologists of digital culture observe how cosmic horror circulates within online communities as a form of participatory mythology. Unlike traditional myths, which assert explanatory closure, cosmic horror encourages perpetual reinterpretation. Each retelling shifts emphasis, psychological, scientific, humorous, ritualistic, speculative. This mutability makes the monsters ideal for fluid, decentralized communities. They generate identity through ambiguity rather than doctrine. The shared act of engaging with the unknown, through stories, art, memes, or scholarship, becomes a form of collective meaning-making. The persistence of cosmic horror in subcultural and academic spaces reveals a universal dynamic. When beings symbolize conceptual limits rather than physical threats, they remain endlessly adaptable. Each group uses the monsters to articulate its own concerns: spiritual uncertainty, cognitive boundaries, technological displacement, existential anxiety. Yet none of these interpretations resolve the underlying tension. The monster remains a placeholder for whatever exceeds comprehension, and so the implications remain deliberately open-ended. Subcultures reinterpret the monsters to explore identity and imagination. Academics use them to interrogate knowledge and perception. But the core idea persists across all appropriations. Human beings live within a reality they can neither fully map nor fully trust. The monsters endure because they remind us, quietly, persistently, that the unknown is not a frontier to be conquered, but a condition to be acknowledged. The most philosophically terrifying cosmic horror monsters endure not because they promise spectacle, but because they articulate a set of psychological and philosophical tensions that modern life cannot easily resolve. They speak to the fear that our minds are not designed to grasp reality in its totality, that the universe may contain layers of structure fundamentally incompatible with human comprehension, and that knowledge, rather than offering safety, may instead reveal our irrelevance. These implications linger precisely because they cannot be dismissed. They echo through scientific discovery, cultural anxiety, and intimate moments of existential doubt. When readers encounter these monsters, they confront not creatures, but the boundaries of their perceptual and cognitive frameworks. One of the central implications is the destabilizing realization that perception is an evolutionary tool rather than a truth-detecting instrument. Cognitive scientists increasingly emphasize that the mind filters reality, presenting only what is useful for survival. This aligns uneasily with the logic of cosmic horror. If our senses provide merely functional illusions, then what remains unseen or unseeable may dwarf everything we consider real. The monsters embody this possibility. Their indescribability is not a stylistic flourish, but a philosophical claim that some entities or forces lie outside the bandwidth of human cognition. The terror arises when readers recognize that the failure to comprehend is not temporary, but intrinsic. The monsters do not hide. We are simply unequipped to perceive them correctly. Another enduring implication concerns the instability of knowledge itself. Cosmic horror suggests that the pursuit of understanding may lead not to enlightenment, but to epistemic collapse. Characters who uncover fragments of forbidden lore often lose their ability to trust memory, perception, or reasoning. This narrative pattern reflects a broader cultural anxiety. The fear that information overload, scientific uncertainty, and rapidly shifting technological landscapes may undermine our confidence in what we know. The monsters become metaphors for the destabilizing consequences of excessive understanding. They represent the moment when inquiry surpasses the mind's capacity to integrate contradiction, forcing individuals to confront the limits of coherent thought. There is also the unsettling question of agency. Many cosmic beings operate according to logics incompatible with intentionality as humans understand it. They neither hate nor target humanity. We simply exist within their sphere of influence. vulnerable to incidental harm. This indifference is more frightening than malevolence. Psychological studies suggest that humans prefer antagonists with motives, because motives imply comprehensibility. The cosmic monster disrupts this preference. Its actions may appear random, cyclic, or mechanically inevitable. The terror lies not in being hunted, but in being irrelevant. This indifference mirrors modern anxieties about global systems, economic, ecological, technological, that shape lives without acknowledging individuality. Philosophically, these monsters raise questions about the nature of reality. When texts describe spaces that obey alternate geometries or dimensions that intersect with the human world only partially, they challenge the assumption that physical reality is stable and intelligible. Contemporary theories in physics, multiverses, non-locality, dark matter, unintentionally echo the genre's themes by highlighting how much of the universe remains unobservable or conceptually inaccessible. Cosmic horror does not claim scientific validity, yet it resonates with scientific humility. The monsters embody the recognition that the universe is not obligated to be comprehensible. Another enduring implication involves the collapse of narrative meaning. Traditional horror interprets fear through moral or thematic frameworks. The haunted house reveals family trauma. The vampire symbolizes forbidden desire. The demon mirrors religious conflict. Cosmic horror denies such interpretative comfort. Its monsters do not carry allegories of sin or consequence. They signify scale, indifference, and incompleteness. This rejection of symbolic clarity destabilizes the human tendency to impose story on experience. When faced with a cosmic entity, characters often find that meaning itself erodes. This narrative effect reflects a deep philosophical anxiety, the suspicion that meaning may be a fragile construct, not a fundamental feature of the universe. Yet the most profound implication may be psychological rather than metaphysical. Cosmic horror forces individuals to confront their relationship to uncertainty. Modern life is saturated with unknowns, ecological tipping points, technological singularities, geopolitical instability. The monsters externalize these anxieties. They provide a language for discussing fears that lack clear objects. To imagine a being beyond comprehension is to acknowledge the limits of prediction, control, and understanding. Instead of promising resolution, cosmic horror invites reflection on vulnerability and humility. The genre's endurance suggests a paradox. Although the monsters reveal human insignificance, readers return to them willingly. This willingness indicates that confronting the unknown offers a peculiar form of psychological clarity. The terror becomes a mirror, reflecting the fragility of cognition, the instability of certainty, and the vastness of a universe that remains indifferent to human narratives. By engaging with these implications, readers participate in a kind of philosophical ritual, a meditation on what it means to exist without guaranteed significance or comprehensive understanding. The implications remain open-ended. The monsters continue to unsettle because they embody questions without answers. What if reality exceeds our cognitive architecture? What if knowledge reveals not order, but disorientation? What if meaning is temporary scaffolding against an indifferent cosmos? The monsters do not resolve these questions. They sustain them. And in this sustained uncertainty lies their enduring power, reminding us that fear, curiosity, and wonder often occupy the same conceptual space, and that the unknown is not a frontier to be conquered, but a condition to be lived within.